Welcome back. It's another chapter of the complete guide to playing tabletop role-playing games online. I'm your host, the Complex Games Apologist. Let's dive on in. Part 2, Virtual Tabletops. How you roll dice in a way that others can see, how you share a game state like a map or a pool of tokens, and possibly how you keep track of characters and gear. I want to start this section out with a caveat. Like with video calls, a lot of the options here are web applications or standalone programs. But unlike with video or voice calling, which is kind of necessary, using a virtual tabletop is not something every game needs or wants for. There's a spectrum of options from just using an online dice rolling app, using a whiteboard in the cloud, once in a while for complex occasions. You could use streaming software to superimpose the relevant info onto your webcam's feed in your video call program. More on that one in the streaming section of this video. Once you step over into using a VTT program, you can use it to manage some parts of your game, but not others, letting it take care of maps and positioning, decks of cards, and pools of tokens. One thing to keep in mind here is that there is a difference between culture of play, between what everyone else is doing, what everyone else is blasting on social media that they're proud of, and that the game that you want to run doesn't have to mimic how the loudest voices are doing it. I would cover this in the section of this video on norms and culture of play, but before we go into the various options for virtual tabletops and what they can do, I think it's important to say this. You don't need, in any hard and fast sense of the word, any of these tools to run a game online. Some rule sets demand a map and miniatures with very loud voice, of course, and for those rules you'll need something unless you want to change things about the rules or handwave the part of the game. By the same token, using these tools doesn't in any hard and fast sense make the game less spontaneous and pure. This next one is just me, but it's purely informed by my opinion, and it's not a hard and fast truth. But word of advice, keep an open mind about joining a game using more or less VTT than what you think of as the middle of the road. I've had a lot of fun using less than I thought I needed, just rolling dice on my desk and saying what I rolled, and I believe some folks have had a bit of fun playing with a little more VTT than they were accustomed to with me. So without further ado, here's the spectrum of virtual tabletops. You can use something like Google Spreadsheets with open edit privileges to move tokens around a map. Just share the link to your friends. It's a pretty self-explanatory way to make something like this happen, but I'll link a tutorial video of a friend's in the description below. You can use an online roller like dice.owenmead or rolls.org. Owen Mead takes care of the symbols on the dice for Fantasy Flight Star Wars, and so that group interpretation moment where you all look down at the results can happen in the collaborative way that's intended for that game. You can summon a dice bot into your Discord server, which we already talked about. You can step into the VTT application space with Roll20 for free and just use it for maps, dice, for decks of cards in a game like Torg, or for tracking the tokens in a game like 2D20. You can go one further and you can get the PC's character sheets into Roll20, and then everyone's basic skills will be macroed and people can click a button and poof, there appears the character's athletic skill check result in Roll20's chat log. The thing to keep in mind here is that it takes time and it takes compute cycles in people's brains to learn and to use the virtual tabletop tools. VTTs generally take up a lot of real estate on people's screens, so if your group really likes to be looking at each other's faces as they play, it can be an issue. Not everyone has two monitors set up, so they can have your video call going on one window and have the VTT open on another screen. Just something to keep in mind, and it's one reason that folks end up going with just a voice call over a video call. So with all that said, we come to the top end, the most VTTing of the VTT options for a fully featured experience. In 90% of the other videos of this topic, these two applications, Roll20 and Fantasy Grounds, end up being compared one-to-one, as if the moment you decide to play a game online, you're going to pick one of these two. Another thing about these comparisons, Other people's is that they tend to work from the assumption that you're getting in to play some kind of fantasy classes and levels style of game, like D&D or Pathfinder. And they also seem to jump into the assumption that you'd like to pay to have something like the full rules running in the game. That you'd also like to pay money to have an officially licensed deployment of the hottest new adventure paths or modules, what I hear kids call pre-written adventures these days. So with all that in mind, I'm going to say something different. Roll20 can do a great deal of stuff for free, and it can do it in a web application. While the people playing with you will have to make a Roll20 account, they won't have that extra gatekeeping layer of having to install and trust an application on their desktop. The ladder from rolling dice to using a map to putting in character sheets to tracking NPC hit points and initiative and so on has a very intuitive little bit at a time feeling to it in Roll20. You can keep doing any one of those on a pen and a paper or in a word processor or on OneNote, and in my experience, the Roll20 features you're not using don't get in your way. Some of the more elaborate things like Fantasy Flight Star Wars dice require you to get a paid subscription to unlock some additional features, but it's amazing how far the free feature set can be stretched. I'm convinced you could even play a game like Torg, which relies on several decks of cards and players having individual hands of cards in Roll20, with a little bit of work from you making the card images or scanning cards that you've bought without paying Roll20 a dime. Meanwhile, Fantasy Grounds has an incredibly high cost of entry just to begin with. At the time of this video, to be able to invite anyone into your games at zero cost to them costs at least $145 for you, with upsells for rule sets beyond D&D. Fantasy Grounds' core feature set is built around the kind of game where maps and character tokens are at the core of play. Fog of War and Line of Sight and automation of spell effects and even assigning damage based on area of effect. All of which are then registered in your GM records or on the NPC's sheets, and parcels of loot dispersed on a map are all possible in Fantasy Grounds. All of that, and the core function of the application, has an incredibly steep learning curve. This comment is just my opinion talking, but Fantasy Grounds' user interface is just weird. It doesn't work like normal Windows, Mac, or even Linux applications. There aren't drop-down menus at the top. When you right-click on things, you get a radial menu rather than a drop-down. The chat window on the left is immutably on top, it seems, and the interface buttons on the right take up an incredible amount of real estate on your screen. And when you click them, a rectangle pops up in the middle of your screen. And when you click a button on one of those rectangles, a new rectangle will pop up on top of the existing one. When different rule sets are loaded in, they bring their own custom cosmetic look, which is great if you want to create those cosmetics. But my impression is that some of those looks can be very loud, and if you loaded in Traveler's rule set, for example, it's got a very loud look that could get in the way of creating your own aesthetic or tone. You can play a different kind of game beyond maps and miniatures in Fantasy Grounds. You can leave the dungeon, and people have done a lot of work to create rules and modules that you can load into Fantasy Ground to do that with, which they will happily charge you for. On the plus side, there is something to be said for how Fantasy Grounds is a full-screen application that takes you away from the distractions of your desktop. And if you're in the mood to learn an entirely new skill apart from role-playing games, you can build up your own Fantasy Grounds rule sets by coding them from scratch. And that's where my comparison between these two programs stops. Because for me, in my world, D&D modules and a fully humming version of the RPG rules inside of the Virtual Tabletop is not my be-all, end-all. I would give it a try who's using that sort of fully featured thing, but I don't expect it from a game master, and I don't feel obliged to provide that sort of thing in order to run the kind of game that I want to for the people whom I like to play with. Just my opinion. That's my thoughts. So take them with a little bit of salt or pepper or sugar or milk or monk fruit or Splenda or Sweet and Low. Roll20 originated in 2012 and hasn't changed much. Fantasy Grounds has been around even longer. And that's why I should mention that there are a lot of innovators out there in the virtual tabletop world building up new platforms and solutions, some of them meant to just manage parts of your game, and others looking to be fully featured creatures cut from a similar cloth. There are a half dozen or more options out there, and I'm loath to play favorites, and I haven't tried any of them yet. So I'm going to throw a few of them up on the screen now, and ask folks to leave their recommendations for the up-and-comers in the comments below. And of course, if you're a loyal user of Roll20 with a paid subscription, or a loyal Fantasy Grounds user, and you think that it might be the sort of thing that a beginner should invest their time in, remember, for beginners in the online play space, you're welcome to disagree with me. I welcome the arguments in the comments below. Have a good one.